just briefly. Stepan Arkadyevich took in and read a liberal paper, not an extreme one, but one advocating the views held by the majority. And in spite of the fact that science, art, and politics had no special interest for him, he firmly held on to those views on all these subjects which were held by the majority and by his paper, and he only changed them when the majority challenged them, or more strictly speaking, when he did not change them, but they imperceptibly changed of themselves within him. Stepan Arkadyevich had chosen his political opinions or his views, or had not chosen his political opinion or his views. These political opinions and views had come to him of themselves, just as he did not choose the shape of his hat or his coat, but simply took those that were being worn. And for him, living in a certain society, owing to the need ordinarily developed at years of destruction for some degree of mental activity, to have views was just as indispensable as to have a hat.
It's Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. Today we're saying a little thank you to all those of you who've supported us on Patreon financially, and as a reminder to those of you who haven't, this is a little bit of a bonus feature. We've got Amber Lee Frost back on to talk to us about media shitness, the crisis in the media, and so on. If you haven't donated to us and would like to do so, we operate a sort of tip jar system. It's patreon.com/bungacast. It'll go towards helping us grow and expand. Thank you very much in advance. Also, if you haven't reviewed us or rated us on iTunes or wherever else, on Facebook, you can do that too. Please consider doing so. Again, greatly appreciated. Cheers. Here's us talking to Amber. Alright, so today we are going to complain about the media and also talk about how everyone should just shut up about the media already, and it's not that important. This is me, Alex Hochuli in Sao Paulo. We have George Hoare in London, and joining us again, actually, a repeat offender on this podcast, Amber Lee Frost. Hi, Amber.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you back. So firstly, we are going to start not about the media specifically, but about an article that you've written called "Why Is It Bernie, Bitch?" Well, actually, I'm asking you the question. Why is it Bernie, bitch? You've written this article, which was in the Baffler, and then suddenly was not in the Baffler, and then was republished in Jacobin. Tell us about the argument. Tell us about the article.
Okay, well, the argument was kind of twofold. One is that Bernie is the most popular left candidate, and two is that he's the one with the best policies. Now that never, ever, ever happens in America. Ever. Like, it just doesn't. So we're at a, this is frankly the most promising political opportunity of my lifetime. It would be stupid to overlook it. He has even a better chance now than he did the first time around. If we can make it clear to people that no one wants to vote for Hillary Clinton because she's a loser, and people are sick of neoliberalism, and we need something that is at least a little bit ostensibly socially democratic, basic social democratic reforms. So I kind of wrote it as a rallying cry to sort of, let's say, politically and morally insecure Bernie fans who, maybe felt like, or were being made to feel foolish for continuing to support him, and then also just an upbraiding of the strayed Bernie-crat media who have since decided they want like Kamala Harris or Beto O'Rourke or some horrible person. Yeah. Which, didn't surprise me. I know these people more or less. They're sniveling little worms. So it was sort of to, embolden, the good people and shame and criticize the bad people in the media. So it ran as "It's Bernie, bitch" the first time, and they even let me use a Photoshop of Bernie's face on Britney Spears' body from the Toxic video.
Which is what everybody wants anyway. I mean...
Exactly.
Politically
Classic
and sexually.
song, classic video, yeah. Then they took it down, and they said they were worried about it being perceived as an endorsement, a political endorsement, and because the Baffler is a 501c3, that could potentially threaten their nonprofit status. So there's a few things wrong with that. One, obviously, it's just me, making this. It didn't say, from the editorial desk of, of the Baffler. Two, Bernie hadn't announced yet. So how could I possibly be making an endorsement for someone who was not yet a candidate?
You're conjuring it into existence.
I know. I'm very powerful, to be fair. And three, you're going to find a lot of similar things in other nonprofits. In fact, Jacobin, who ran it, are a 501c3, and there were two other publications that offered to run it, and they're 501c3 as well. So I don't really know exactly what happened, and I never will. I do know that my editor was incredibly supportive of me, and that this came from the publishing side, was his words. What that means, I do not know. It's possible there were threats. It's possible it's just social pressure. It's possible that a bunch of online pantsuit nation feminists just tweeted at someone until they cried, and they're like, we have to take this down. I literally have no idea whatsoever, and I will probably never know. But the point is, it popped back up on Jacobin and iRise, Phoenix-like, and it's still Bernie.
I mean, I do want to get onto the substance of the argument, but it is weird that the article should have been pulled, particularly in the context of so much partisan media nowadays, that somehow this particular article presented a problem for the publisher.
Yeah. Weird is definitely one word for it. And I think it's interesting, and I think people should start asking themselves exactly why it is so dangerous to publish support for Bernie and not literally anyone else.
Right, and we've seen just now, I think, that Wall Street is willing to accept any Democratic Party candidate other than possibly not as Elizabeth Warren and certainly not Bernie Sanders, which I guess is a good indication of what is the better option there, needless to say.
Right.
So how, just a more general question, which I think follows on from Alex's. So how would you say, how is the US media framing this already interminable 2020 election? It feels like it's been going on for a while, but we've still got a long way to go before we get there. What's the media framing? It's
been going for my entire life now. I think this primary has been going for 100 years, and it's not even everyone has announced yet. Bernie hasn't even announced yet.
Well, especially imagine for people whose political awakening was sort of 2016, they hadn't really paid attention until around then, that it probably has been their whole, at least politically awake lifetimes.
Yeah, and that is a lot of people. It's not just people who just came of voting age either, because no one cared prior to this for 8 years. It was just everything was on autopilot. I write in the article that Obama was a horoscope candidate, where how you read a horoscope and it says things that are so vague, you're like, oh, that could probably apply to me. And I think they think they're going to be able to get away with that again. So they're so for example, we don't have any semblance of socialized healthcare in America. It's extremely bad. It's the worst healthcare in any developed nation. It's worse than a lot of developing nations as well. And you'll see people, it's the number one voting issue for most people in America. And you'll see candidates now talking about access to healthcare or, affordable healthcare. They're not saying Medicare for all, really, or they'll say it like Kamala Harris did, and they'll backtrack. So
they'll say Medicare for most.
Yeah. Medicare for some. And what they're suggesting is, or leaving room for something maybe similar to like Ireland's healthcare system, where they have a subsidized private system and arguably expansive public system. But it's shit. I was just there writing about this, and the Irish people are like, oh, this is the most disgraceful healthcare in Europe. But the media is treating this like, oh, look, they have the things that you want. They're saying, affordable healthcare, and it's actually very impressive the way people are becoming sort of resistant to this. They're not falling for a horoscope again. And yeah, I think there is a sense of, I generally say that neologism is the intellectualism of morons, but I term something pessimism, where the sort of ostensible left of center, media class people will go for, and this is polled similarly as well. They'll sort of endorse or favor a candidate to the right of what the general public is willing to accept. And they'll argue that that's the more realistic candidate, that that's the only way they can win. They'll make all kinds of just bullshit arguments about it. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, I think they're scared to be wrong, and it's, kind of an attempt to, preserve your career because America is not like the UK, where you can be like Paul Mason and literally never be right your entire career until you have a job. You look foolish and then you stop getting work.
Well, I mean, normally the order of affairs is that if you're pessimistic and you're proved right, brilliant, you're very sharp. If you're pessimistic and you're proved wrong, no one remembers, no one pays attention. If you're optimistic and you're proved wrong, then everyone will call you up on it, except for Paul Mason, who often is very optimistic that everything is kicking off, and then it doesn't really quite kick off in the way that he expected it to, and people just seem to let him off the hook.
This time he could just be right about the EU. It could be reformable.
He's amazing. It's just, he's so confident too. I wake up every day unsure of myself all the time, and I gotta say, I am more often right than not. That man has the confidence of, I don't even know.
Yeah, it's remarkable.
What must that be like, to just have cocaine confidence all the time, no matter how wrong you've been your whole life? But anyway, yeah, so people are sort of trying to, preserve their credibility. They're very scared of appearing kind of overly optimistic or starry-eyed, because that's the worst thing you could possibly be in the American media, because that means you're unserious. But, poll after poll shows that Bernie is the most popular politician in America. It's just, again, this never happens. It never happens.
As you say, both on personality. Sorry, I mean, both on personality terms as well as in the concreteness of his program. I don't think you're very clear about this. There is no real other option. Elizabeth Warren, I think, is the only other vaguely serious candidate, and she's completely farcical. I mean, we don't even have to get onto the sort of maybe phony, maybe real Native American roots and those sorts of claims.
I believe that she believes it, but that's worse.
I said we weren't getting onto it.
This is an adult woman that doesn't understand the concept of family lore.
Right. That's it. And then also getting into, when you start getting white people talking about the correct composition of blood and ethnicity, that gives me the creeps. So it should just better not go down that road.
Her campaign slogan should be "Whip out the calipers."
I did want to ask you before we get on to the main meal of this discussion about Bernie. I mean, I guess, as I say, I found your argument very persuasive. I don't think there is any other realistic option other than, even taking into account whatever deficiencies you might see in Bernie's candidature. It's the only social democratic one. I guess the question is then, should you back a social democratic candidate? Should we throw so much energy, if you're an American, should you throw so much energy behind campaigning and trying to get Bernie elected, and invest so much hopes in the Democratic Party when it has proved to be a failure? I just want to quote from your article, because you write that another lukewarm Democratic presidency, that is to say, not Bernie's, another lukewarm Democratic presidency will not only further impoverish and destabilize the working class and its suffering institutions, it will also all but guarantee that 2024 brings us POTUS Hamburglar in an SS uniform. I guess my question to you is this the pivotal moment? I mean, wasn't it when George W. Bush was running? Wasn't it when it was Reagan? I mean, is this not a kind of rhetorical inflation that we've heard before?
No. I again, because we really didn't have a contender prior to then. And also, I think like class consciousness in America is finally kind of on the upswing. It's very nascent. I don't want to like overestimate it or overstate it, but we have a moment here where the idea of a candidacy could yield more, let's say not substantive, but more comprehensive political goals. So I am not an electoralist, and I meaning that's not the kind of politics that I like to follow and that I've worked on historically. I mainly because I really don't like the Democratic Party, and I feel like you kind of have to kill a part of yourself to really throw yourself into those kinds of politics. This isn't to say that I don't think they're strategic and that people should never participate in them, because at the end of the day, I think politics is, about gaining power, and you really need to do sometimes some things as basic as alleviating suffering. That is, of course, a horrible position politically to be in, because like what you're offering is, political palliative care. And I don't like that I have to focus on an election. I am, very much of the kind of labor, sort of trade unionist position, which is a shit thing to be into if you're American. But at the same time, a Bernie presidency would take the boot off the neck of the trade unions. And long term, what I want more than a socialist party of, cardigan wearing graduate students is a labor party, is something where the institutions of the working class, which to me are trade unions, steer a political project. And as fucked up as trade unions are, I really, truly believe that is the only way forward. That said, a Bernie presidency would give us some room to breathe, because it's just structurally almost impossible to do anything right now. And the idea that you can just organize your way out of anything, like you get disabused of that pretty quickly in America. You're just going to get crushed. It's an extremely anti-worker country all across the country. And we don't have things as basic as, socialized healthcare. And I think also when you talk to people from other countries, they don't understand why we focus on this thing. They think we're focusing on it because it's just, it's a nice social democratic reform or whatever. And it is, but it's not just that. It's the idea that most people work the jobs that they do in the way that they do and have the relationship to their employer formed by their access to healthcare. So socialized healthcare it's not just a nice thing to have, it would fundamentally change the relationship of most of working class people to their employers.
Yeah, it is really a linchpin, and I think the best writing around this has framed it in terms of freedom, not just about alleviating suffering or even about equality of access.
Exactly.
But about freedom. And that's really important. Exactly. And it's a discourse which has disappeared from most of the left. And ultimately that is the fundamental argument for socialism, right? That it'll make you more free.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's definitely missing from Republican ideas of freedom on the left or their relationship to socialism. This is something we've talked about so many times that we need to have an episode on. So, yeah.
We're just going to keep reminding ourselves until we actually get our asses and do that episode.
And you can't really talk about socialism in America, by the way, without talking about freedom. I mean, for all the kind of, damn American with freedom, like it is something we value abstractly without quite knowing what it is for both good and bad reasons.
Oh yeah, and that provides Americans with a far better base for socialism than the case is in Britain, for example, which is took a step forward around 400 years ago and then decided to take a step back and never went forward again.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's yeah, it's a really important sort of principle to stress. I don't think that like the idea of boutique socialism for, different cultures is a thing. I think fundamentally things, people are the same, and people living under capitalism are dealing with the same issues. But when you are sort of, doing what I do and making propaganda, you look around and you see what matters to people, and freedom's a big one.
Yeah. No, it gives you a far better base. And, I think even in the worst case scenario, a Bernie candidacy and a presidency would at least vest the public realm with a sense of hope. But for real this time, not like Obama, because it actually promises some concrete changes. Right.
And that's the good thing about him, is that he is extremely concrete. So even if he just, completely went insane and ran off on us, which, Daddy would never do, we still have those ideas in our head, and people still love the idea of, again, a kind of, American sort of rebellious spirit or whatever of like, well, if I had socialist healthcare, I could tell my boss to fuck off and not worry about getting my kids insulin. It just completely changes the relationship between, employer and worker.
So let's move on. Speaking about the public realm, I'm going to quote from an article of yours, which has come out or will come out very shortly, depending on when you're listening to this. So you write that the failing New York Times, in quotation marks, and its fellows now thrash in fury at their sudden irrelevance to these crude new political elites. It is unable to conceive of a world in which it was so very wrong, and unable to cope with a political administration that speaks of them with utter contempt. Not only has it lost the king's ear, it is finding itself entirely incapable of appealing to the peasants. The cynical and transparent hit pieces on Bernie Sanders betray the paper's general contempt for mass politics. Now, long-time listeners of this podcast will even identify some familiar ideas in there, and I think we have to bring it up. It's what we call...
I know. I just want to let you know, though, I did put knobs in the first draft, and it got cut.
Oh, shit. Well, thanks for the shout-out anyway.
This media is so biased against real ideas.
Yeah,
people need to hear about. Oh.
It's marginalizing independent media like Alpha Bunga Bunga. It's just fucking outrageous.
She was like, it's too long, and you either need to build it out into its old like, she's like, you don't have enough space, because it should, like, my word count was literally like 2,000 or whatever. She's like, if you had 4,000, you could do it.
You need 2,000 words to explain this out. Shit.
She's kind of right, but that's what podcasts are for.
Exactly,
because you never have enough words on the page.
So to speak about what those words actually are, it's neoliberal order breakdown syndrome for those who aren't familiar, maybe new listeners. We talked about this on an episode a while back. You can look it up. We spoke about it in relation to the media. The New York Times perhaps exemplifies this best, this sort of hysterical and intemperate response to liberals' loss of influence. So maybe you could talk us through your argument, which is presented in that article in the Columbia Review of Journalism.
Well, okay. So everyone whose job it was to predict the 2016 election, dropped the ball. There were weird anomalies of people predicting it, but it was more kind of a, MAGA triumphalism. I think a few people like Michael Moore, the documentarian, predicted it, and he's from, declining post-industrial Rust Belt America. And I think, that probably gave him a tip off. But what they mostly didn't want to admit is that Hillary Clinton was not an inspiring candidate. What they chose to say instead is that people were so thrilled by, the more backward elements of Donald Trump's campaign that they rushed to the polls to vote for bigotry. And it's important to point out that not only it is more that Hillary Clinton lost than that Donald Trump won. Mm. And one of the reasons, voter turnout was just terrible. And one of the reasons they went for the Trump voters did go for him, I think the big reason is that he was the only candidate talking about jobs. So people focus on, the racism and the wall, and it's hard not to, because he is a cruel, stupid idiot. But I mean, there's just like no sense of, well, why did they really vote for him? So they do these strange kind of this series of articles where they're like, we talked to a Trump voter. And I'm like, yeah, I bet you did. And they kind of, they do a little bit of hillbilly tourism or whatever. What they don't talk to is Trump's actual base, which are sort of the, small business owner kind of.
The kind of provincial petty bourgeoisie.
Petty bourgeoisie, exactly. I call them riding mower dads.
Right.
And I think maybe the equivalent of which really bolstered, say someone like Bolsonaro. I think we have really kind of underestimate the viciousness of the petty bourgeoisie. But there was a working class contingency to the Trump voters, and a lot of them did live in places that were deindustrialized. And he was talking about jobs, and Hillary Clinton wasn't.
Yeah,
in the British cases, it's not Trump, it's Brexit that the media fails to explain and doesn't even in some cases want to. There was a poll by the Political Studies Association, or a survey of experts, which I saw somebody tweeting about. I think it was Matthew Goodwin tweeting about today. They said that 97% of journalists, along with 92% of pollsters and 87% of academics, predicted a Remain victory before the 2016 referendum. And afterwards, it's just been, how can we explain this? Well, I actually left London and spoke to a Leave voter. And it's this, I guess it's kind of this, I don't know, weird ethnographic study of people who disagree with you, along with opinion in lieu of fact, an absence of Labour reporting, content instead of reporting, a lack of local news. These are some of the signs of this I don't know, knobs applied to journalism or media terribleness. What else is there?
It favors a kind of like bumpkin anthropology, and just they're very contemptuous. Like this is one of the weirdest things about the media, is that they don't get that people hate them for good reasons. Actually, one of the only people that I sort of liked on this is a total liberal, and it's Edward Luce from Financial Times, and he wrote a book about liberalism, and he actually, I think because he's like from this kind of aristocratic tradition of British liberals that whose ancestors avoided a bourgeois revolution by being like, look, we have to give them things, or what happened in France is going to happen here. And he was like, oh, look, people are suffering. Of course they hate elites. Of course they hate liberals. And of course he arrives at some dumb, sort of technocratic solution for how we need to manage liberalism better or whatever. But nonetheless, he does not shy away from, the hatred of the people. He's like, maybe actually we have fucked up the entire world for a huge number of people who are suffering.
Right, and the FT provides actually a pretty nice contrast, and we should get on to that, because you do mention it several times in the piece. The FT, I mean, it's the only newspaper that I subscribe to, because I think it's the only kind of decent paper that I can go and read the reporting and just go, yeah, okay, I've informed myself about what's going on in the world, and that has a pretty global purview and everything else. And, this is something that's sorely lacking. I think if you take the newspapers of record in various different countries, they're just completely inadequate, and they've deteriorated over the past 20, 30 years. So kind of what's happened to we can be maybe a little bit more technical or specific about this. What's happened to journalism? What's happened to reporting? What's happened to the news media?
Well, okay, so people generally point to the internet creating, disrupting journalism, which is true, but it has been on the decline since before that. The internet definitely accelerated all this stuff, because why would you buy a newspaper if you can get it for free? And then, of course, why would you pay a journalist if you could, pay a content creator? So there's been a lowering of sort of journalistic standards and, what they call deprofessionalization, which I think can be kind of a silly a silly term from people with like masters in journalism when it's like, you have a technical skill. I don't think someone needs to to have a master's in journalism to be a good journalist. There's been a shift in the way people consume media, certainly. That's been happening since television, however. And, the internet accelerated it greatly. And a lot of local papers just died. They just collapsed completely. And so no one was getting, news from most of the country the way they did, say maybe even 30 years ago. So they were able to ignore all of these places that maybe didn't find Hillary Clinton very inspiring.
Do you think it only really then became an issue sort of from 2016 onwards then? So basically this decline had been happening. But because there hadn't really been any, at least in America or in the UK, there hadn't really been any politics, so it didn't really matter. And it's only now that actually the rot has been revealed in those two countries, and we've actually seen, oh wow, this is what happens if you don't pay correspondents and you just pay people to write opinion pieces. This is what you're going to get if those material basis of the production of newspapers just get completely whittled away.
It's like it's a bit like the fire department. So New York City is more fireproof than it has ever been. There aren't a lot of fires, but if there is a fire, you need to have a fire department. So it's like there was a fire and they were like, oh, I thought we didn't have these anymore. I thought politics were done. I thought things were done happening. And they just completely misjudged the situation. But I think you're right. I mean, there's been such a lull that it didn't really matter if they were wrong because, like what was there to be wrong about? And moreover, this is something that, we talk about the kind of bumpkin anthropology thing, but this is something that the, New York Times op-ed section, like David Brooks, like they loved doing that stuff before this. It's just that now they're realizing those people hate them.
Yeah. And, I think one of the, to take the contrast with the FT, like the FT has maintained a high standard of quality because the people who read the FT, I'm not talking about myself, I mean, just people, their kind of target audience need to know about the world because they're making important decisions that shape the world, often for the worse, but,
podcasters.
Like podcasters, yeah. But, they need to know what's going on, basically.
Yeah.
And a lot of the world has basically, or in vast swathes of Western society, has stopped caring about what's going on because nothing actually really matters. Everything's kind of on autopilot, and the withdrawal from the public realm is a widely discussed and thoroughly analyzed feature of the contemporary world. And, this is one facet of it, that people don't need to buy and read newspapers because whatever, you're focusing on your gardening or your home improvement or getting drunk or whatever, the outside world, the public realm has stopped mattering. And then suddenly it matters again. And I think that's probably one of the reasons behind something that you talk about in the article, which is the Trump bump, which is suddenly the NYT and the Washington Post suddenly get a huge bump of subscribers because suddenly for them, and I don't mean the liberal elite, I mean, liberal middle class people, not major decision makers, but for them suddenly the world matters again because they feel they're not influential anymore, or they feel that, the other team is suddenly in power and the world is slipping away from them. And so I've got to get to grips with what's going on in the world. And suddenly you start buying newspapers again, which I guess is a good thing, right? Maybe newspapers will return.
No. No, what it's done is turned journalism into, I guess this kind of already happened, but now that journalism is entertainment, the New York Times sees its job as, kind of the way social media, sees its job, is to sort of give people that kind of instantaneous rush of something they can click on, which is why they just just report on Trump ad nauseum, even when he doesn't do anything. I think you had a guest, I think Jason Walsh.
Yeah.
On.
I'm just basically stealing all my ideas from what he said back in episode 14 or something.
Right, we won't tell him. But yeah, people are reading the news because things are happening. But fundamentally, originally they asked me to write about why leftists hate the media, which is too broad of a question, and it depends what you mean by media, and et cetera, et cetera. So I did a comparison I essentially wrote, why I read FT and not the New York Times. And fundamentally, it's because the New York Times understands that the world is a conflict between the haves and have-nots, because it's read by capitalists who, gamble on those conflicts. And the New York Times is a paper for liberals who believe the world is a competition between ideas and ideologies. And liberals are fundamentally, political hobbyists. Did either of you ever read Anna Karenina? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. There's this. Do you mind if I just have this quote? You can cut it entirely if you want.
As long as it's not a spoiler.
Very beautiful. It's not a spoiler. There's no spoilers in Russia.
No spoilers on this podcast.
Yeah. So just briefly, Stepan Arkadyevich took in and read a liberal paper, not an extreme one, but one advocating the views held by the majority. And in spite of the fact that science, art, and politics had no special interest for him, he firmly held on to those views on all these subjects which were held by the majority and by his paper, and he only changed them when the majority challenged them, or more strictly speaking, when he did not change them, but they imperceptibly changed of themselves within him. Stepan Arkadyevich had chosen his political opinions or his views, or had not chosen his political opinion or his views. These political opinions and views had come to him of themselves, just as he did not choose the shape of his hat or his coat, but simply took those that were being worn. And for him, living in a certain society, owing to the need ordinarily developed at years of destruction for some degree of mental activity, to have views was just as indispensable as to have a hat. That, to me, is the perfect description of a New York Times reader.
Need something to talk about in over dinner, cocktail parties.
It's dinner party talking points. And when you look at the Trump bump, they haven't done really anything with it. It's not like you've seen this huge increase in investigative journalism. You've seen, just this expanding kind of op-ed section and really lurid stuff around Me Too, which I think has kind of represented the failure of accessing sort of feminist schools politically and instead trying to have these cultural moments. The op-ed section, by the way, that failed to predict Trump, they've done nothing with this. They've had no mea culpa. They've had no, moment of reflection. It's the Simpsons meme with the, Skinner. Am I out of touch? No, it's the children who must be wrong. So they've done nothing with it.
Just to go back to an earlier point that you made about the FT, it reminded me of Bob Crow, who was the trade unionist leader in the UK, whose mum told him, you've got to read the FT, read the Financial Times and read the Morning Star, and don't believe anything that's in the FT. Because they're the ones who treat politics like class struggle. They're on different sides, but that's their lens. And then the liberal, all the ones in the middle, it's just not the same thing. It's hats to wear, and it's not as serious. They haven't got as much skin in the game.
Yeah, I think I ended it with some phrase like I haven't read this draft in a while, but I read FT. Even though they're rooting for the other team, but they know who the teams are.
Yeah,
and
there's a realism there.
Just don't. Yeah,
there's a putting the world as it exists before your own interpretation or opinions or wishes, of it. So maybe this is a good segue to move on to the kind of last section and try to discuss what explains the shitness of the media. We were actually trying to think of what way to kind of package this up, and we just came up with media shitness. I suggested news pissers, which George laughed at, rightly so, because it's terrible. So
I can't believe you said that.
we're going with media shitness.
Double down on it.
That's
fine.
it. But basically, there's an absence of realism, I think, in newspaper reporting. And part of it is that newspapers aren't paying for reporters out in the field to go and do that beat and report on the local crime stories or about what's happening in East Africa and just be filing reports every week. And, that ends up building up a picture of the world such that you don't get completely surprised when something major happens, that you can actually insert facts and events into a framework and a narrative and make sense of the world. I mean, just that stuff about understanding the world, it seems to be a not very highly valorized thing these days because everybody's kind of a media critic, right? Everyone's a constructionist, so you can't say things, you can't use a category without it being... So for example, I mean, we were kind of talking these questions over, George and I, beforehand, and just like, trying to think of examples. So, you get a man gets attacked in the street, right? And then it becomes, well, this is a racist attack on this man. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. You can't, before you can even start discussing the facts of the event, you already have a discussion which intercedes saying, but was it really racist? Because, all he said was mentioned the man's skin color. Oh no, you said it wasn't racist, and of course it was. How were you not mentioning that it was racist? You're whitewashing this event. And it's like, holy shit, hang on, can we just talk about what actually happened first before we get into this secondary discussion?
Yeah, well, and this is the position that I'm in, because I'm not really a journalist. I do some journalism sometimes, but fundamentally I'm a propagandist for the workers' movement, first and foremost. Nonetheless, I think the role of propaganda and the sort of role of rhetoric has been vastly overstated, and those categories have kind of mooshed together. And you're right, all media is about the media now. It is insane. The media is, it's just like how the movies that win the Oscars are all about the film industry. Like, the media is so up its own ass. It just writes about itself constantly. And I'm not averse to
write about what you know. They took that advice, write about what you know.
Yeah, exactly. So they never learned about anything else. They just navel gazed. But it's insane. And I think you sort of saw, this mutant child of like kind of Daily Show thought expand out into this whole like we're recapping the news, but like where do you go to read the news? And most people don't have that. I mean, people did start to under Obama get their news from the Daily Show. It was like very statistically significant number of people did.
Sorry. I literally posted that on Facebook a little while ago. Like, where do you go to read the news? Like, I actually was kind of like, I'm just frustrated because I was using The Guardian because it was free and it was terrible. And I ended up coming to the conclusion, which is I'm just going to have to pay for an FT subscription. Like, this is just a good use of money.
The Guardian's worse than the New York Times. It's insane.
Yeah.
We could talk for a whole another hour about The Guardian. But they should pay people to read it. They should not expect people to pay to read it.
I can't figure out its business model, but we have this joke that like 1/3 of the employment in the UK must just be freelance Guardian columnists. Like, what the fuck is going on? And none of it's all the most disposable stuff, and there doesn't appear to be much reportage, and I don't know why it exists. It cannot justify itself. It cannot justify its own existence. Anyway,
that's a tough thing to ask the Guardian to do. But I think there's a point you made earlier about why does the left hate the New York Times? And I think there's a general, maybe the left cares about the media a lot, whether liking or disliking specific publications. There's clearly a lot of importance put on the media, and sometimes it's adduced as an explanation for failure. Like, if only we didn't have all of these all this brainwashing, then we actually could have won something. But maybe it's
no, and that's a cancerous kind of thought too that we really need to wring out of people as well. I'm not of the Stuart Hall or one of these weird Gramscians. Like, all we need to do is just have a publication that tells the truth. Well, I actually think people know the truth. It doesn't really just knowing things doesn't manifest political change. That's absurd. So I don't want to overstate the kind of political power of the media, but I do think there is a utility to the media, especially one that's well-oiled and smart and comprehensive and relatively exploratory. But no, I mean, what people want the media to do is what political institutions need to do, which we don't have right now. But I don't know. It's not even a chicken and egg thing to me, because to me, the media could be utter shit and we could still have a vibrant. I mean, okay, so I think things are a little more politically happening in the UK right now. The media can't take any credit for that at all. Everyone wants to say, oh, it's Ash Sarkar saying I'm actually a communist or whatever. No, that's absurd. It was, a bunch of mums knocking on doors to get behind a candidate they liked. And it was not even a huge expanse in population of trade unionists, but an invigorated and sort of militant and focused trade union movement. But
the Corbyn surge actually is an interesting example. I mean the surge both in terms of his own election to Labour Party leader and his re-election, and the Labour's relatively positive performance in the last general election, which is very much in spite of the predominant media narrative, which was against him. And suddenly the left argument that, well, we can't get anywhere because the Daily Mail and the Sun are always saying bad things about the left.
Absurd. Well, no one likes the Daily Mail or the Sun, and people don't trust the media. And I think actually it may have even helped Corbyn a little bit that these people were so ruthless, because the media's overestimation of its own charisma, it is impressive. Well, it is hubris.
You get this weird thing where you have, often kind of middle class, maybe liberal or left wing intellectuals overstating the influence the media has. And actually for most people, they'll read a tabloid or whatever because they want to just get the news or read the sports results or whatever, and don't actually place that much emphasis on what it's actually saying. I mean, in fact, one of the problems of our time is precisely the lack of trust in anything, and the deep skepticism with which any kind of media institution is held, which I think is a problem, which allows the perpetuation of fake news. I mean, we can kind of problematize that category and whatever, but it is a remarkable thing that, absurd rumors passed around on WhatsApp get taken more seriously in certain circumstances than what newspapers are publishing, and that's something to grapple with. And so, the idea that anybody could be brainwashed in our times by the mainstream media is completely bonkers.
Yeah. And we haven't appeared to learn much. And I say we as in kind of the media, even though I'm in the non-traditional or independent media. But my colleagues at the more formal institutions, if you will, don't really understand that people don't listen to them and don't like them, and they have some good reasons for that.
Just a point on this on this fake news and the moral panic around that. It seems to me like some of the people who are getting most exercised around this and around the media in general are people whose view of I guess the working class in general as political actors is pretty, that people are pretty easily swayed, and that people they will see something on a bus and then they will vote for this thing, or they will read this one isolated bit of news from a Russian bot or
they believe in,
and they will do that. So it's a weird model of political agency that some people are operating with, I think.
Well, they believe in hypnosis. They believe in subliminal messaging. They have this almost superstitious kind of idea of, it's like miasma theory of how media operates, which is, utterly absurd, especially in our contemporary era when there's so much competing media that nothing really holds too much weight. I've said this before, but I think, those people who might consider themselves to be part of what may someday hope to be something approaching a nascent left need to grapple with there's two things. One, we need to figure out what is new and what is the same issues that we've always been dealing with that may in fact look differently. I think the left gets distracted by shiny things very quickly. And they're like, the Paul Mason thing, like, it's going to be the internet. The internet is going to change everything. The internet is made it. It's like, no, you still need institutions. Still need institutions. Mm-hmm. By the way, why do you keep having these fucking Italians on with their digital fucking, we're just a post-political party, for God's sakes. It's an entire country of Paul Masons.
A country of Paulo Masones. No, that Paolo Garbado's argument is actually quite critical of the digital party, but
he's pretty critical. But still, it's a thing. He should have gone harder. I think he should have gone harder. But I think he's a gentle heart from a think tank background. But the second thing is we need to deal with the fact that people have a really, what I find to be un-Marxist contempt for the masses, and that they think they're sort of stupid, and that we need to sort of trick them into socialism by grabbing onto whatever zeitgeist is floating around and then hiding our real political agenda behind that. And it's stupid. You can't trick people into socialism. Just say, look, the world is class war. We need to build institutions to fight this. The same institutions that we used to build, which, I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with me on this. And that's the way forward. It's that we can't tell what is new and what is old, and that we think people are stupid. And both of those things are real stumbling blocks, especially with regards to media analysis. And it's how you end up with this dumb Stuart Hall idea of the soft power, and this whole thing was a war of propaganda. No, it wasn't. No one liked those fucking papers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that neophilia is particularly egregious, and particularly people who think that they're switched on and trying to understand what's coming next, to then be cheerleading every new development as the big thing, which we now have to adapt to. This changes everything. Actually blinds you to a lot of kind of quite fundamental things which don't change that much. And as you say, it's still class war.
I think it's absolutely crucial, this point about the some people on the left having an anti-mass sentiment, because it comes through with respect to media, it comes through with respect to democracy, that there's a questioning of majoritarian ideas in political thought, and it comes through when people are like, well, you can't really trust the working class to vote because they might have been swayed by this publication or that, and it's a big problem if the left swallows this, because I think, and we've given Stuart Hall a kicking previously on this podcast, and maybe Gramsci too to a certain extent. But I think it's a big problem if the left doesn't ally it, or it doesn't really get behind people and say, right, the people, that is, and say, well, this is the only thing that's ever going to drive us to socialism, is winning people over, because people are winnable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you see it with the kind of anti-populist sentiment, and I think there's I thought what Anton Yeager had, not just reference other, this is like one of two podcasts that I listen to, not to just reference other guests, but I'm very skeptical of these kind of like populist movements. Nonetheless, they do represent a pull towards democratic movements that have been heavily resisted and suppressed by contemporary liberalism. Like, people don't like the order of things. They're trying something different. And your response to that is that, like, whatever, they're all fascists. They're all things. Like, what are you, a child?
Yeah,
like,
no one owes you anything. No one is, you don't own this constituency. If people aren't voting for you, you're going to have to think harder about how you're going to respond to that, what you're going to offer people. and how you go about your political praxis.
Maybe it's your fault. Like, this is what, this is what the liberal media doesn't get. Maybe it's your fault. Maybe people don't like you because you're unlikable and they can sense your contempt for them.
Right. And I think probably on the next time that we have you on, you can just spend your time slagging off previous guests. We can just record that.
No, look, my record has been I'm very pro Anton Yeager. I liked his appearance. Jason Walsh. I just this
has to be cut when you start saying people you don't like.
We're just gonna keep in the good stuff. All right, Amber, we're gonna have to wrap here. Thank you very much for joining us for this chat on the media and Bernie and various other things beside. We'll have to have you on again soon. Cheers, Amber.
All right, thanks. Bye.
It's patreon.com/bungacast, bungacast, 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 bungacast.